Just a couple of minutes left in this program. We will leave it at this point to go live now to the U.S. Senate. A quick reminder that you can see this program online anytime at cspan.org. Looking at the U.S. Capitol here, the Senate is about to gavel in to begin the day. More work is expected today on the federal budget agreement, with a final vote on that due to hit at about 4:30 Eastern today, although senators could yield back some of the time to move that vote forward. We also expect work on the 2014 defense programs. A procedural vote on that could also occur today. And now live to the floor of the U.S. Senate here on C-SPAN 2.
The Senate will come to order. The chaplain, Dr. Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Our Father, the giver of every good and perfect gift, live within us so that we will be established in faith and abounding in thanksgiving. Today, help our lawmakers to seek the things that are above as you empower them to embrace kindness, compassion, humility, patience, and forbearance. May they give you preeminence in all things, rejoicing even in the trials they must endure for your sake. Lord, inspire them to persevere with joy in the calling you have given them to protect freedom and to keep America strong. Enable them to bear fruits that will bless this nation and our world. We pray in your great name. Amen.
Amen. Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., December 18, 2013. To the Senate. Under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Edward J. Markey, a senator from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Patrick J. Leahy, President Pro Tempore.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
I move to proceed to calendar number 243S1356.
The clerk will report the motion.
Motion to proceed to calendar number 243, S1356, a bill to amend the Workforce Investment Act of 1998 and so forth and for other purposes.
Mr. President, following my remarks and those of the Republican leader, the Senate will resume consideration of the motion to concur in the House message with respect to the bipartisan budget agreement, post-cloture. Roll call votes are possible throughout the day. We'll notify senators as soon as we have votes that we believe will be forthcoming. Mr. President, I'm told there are two bills at the desk due for second reading.
The clerk will read the titles for a second time.
S-1845, a bill to provide for the extension of certain unemployment benefits and for other purposes. S-1846, a bill to delay the implementation of certain provisions of the Bigger Waters Flood Insurance Reform Act of 2012 and for other purposes.
Mr. President, I would reject any further proceedings with respect to these two bills?
Objection is heard. The bills will be placed on the calendar.
Mr. President, today the Senate is debating the House-passed budget agreement, which was an important step in avoiding another dangerous and costly government shutdown to our economy like we had in January. Another shutdown caused by the Republicans would undercut the economic progress of the last 4 years. When Republicans closed the federal government for business in October, it caused $2 billion in lost productivity alone. The combined cost of the shutdown and Republicans' threats to force a catastrophic default on the nation's bills cost the economy 120,000 private sector jobs in the first 2 weeks of October alone. 120,000 jobs. But the agreement the Senate is considering today will help us avoid another costly shutdown. The bargain rolls back the painful and arbitrary cuts of the sequester, including devastating cuts to education, medical research, infrastructure investments, and defense jobs. This isn't a perfect bargain. No compromise is ever perfect. But the Senate should pass this agreement quickly so the Appropriations Committee, under the leadership of Chairwoman Mikulski, can begin crafting appropriation bills. It's unfortunate that Republicans have forced the Senate to run out the clock on this measure, even though it passed the House on an overwhelming basis and a bipartisan basis and has the support of the majority of the Senate. Why are we wasting the time? It's time to get back to setting fiscal policy through the regular order of the budget process rather than hostage-taking, which takes place so often here by my Republican colleagues. And it's time for Congress to show the American people that Democrats and Republicans can compromise rather than lurching from crisis to crisis. Yet Republicans have insisted on wasting 30 hours of the Senate's time before allowing a final vote on this measure, even though they know it will pass with bipartisan support. I read that the Republican leadership may also force the Senate to work through the weekend and next week by dragging out the consideration of several important executive nominations. That would be unfortunate. But if it happens, it happens. The Senate could wrap up work on the budget bill, pass the defense authorization legislation, and confirm these nominees by tomorrow afternoon. The only thing keeping us here is more Republican obstruction. I was also troubled to hear the senior senator from Kentucky say that the nominations we've considered this session and those in which I filed cloture yesterday are non-essential. Non-essential? How about the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security? That's non-essential? The person assigned the task for protecting us from terrorist attacks? Non-essential? I think that's wrong. Does a Republican leader consider the Secretary of the Air Force or the diplomats who run the State Department non-essential? There's a long list of people that have been confirmed that are essential to running this government. Does a Republican leader consider the judges that try criminal and civil cases in overcrowded courtrooms across the nation non-essential? We confirmed talented and dedicated individuals to all of these essential posts last week. And does a Republican leader consider the chairman of the Federal Reserve, who sets this nation's monetary policy, to be non-essential? We'll consider Janet Yellen's nomination to lead this very important part of our government, the Federal Reserve. We'll do it this week. We'll also vote on a number of other nominations, including a new director for the Internal Revenue Service, non-essential, and the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. And we'll consider the nomination of Brian Davis of Florida, perfect, classic example, Mr. President, to fill a district court seat that has been declared a judicial emergency. His nomination has been pending for more than 650 days. Non-essential? I don't think so. On the contrary, these are absolutely essential nominees. It's their job to carry out justice, protect our country, and safeguard our economy. And it's the Senate's job to confirm them. But, Mr. President, how long will it take the Senate to complete its job? It's up to my Republican friends. Mr. President?
Will the majority leader yield for a question?
I would note the absence of quorum.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President.
The senator from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask unanimous consent to vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection.
And I ask unanimous consent to speak for 2 minutes as if in morning business.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of the House message to accompany H.J. Res. 59, which the clerk will report.
House message to accompany H.J. Res. 59.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to speak for 2 minutes.
Without objection, the senator from Louisiana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Obviously, I'll be brief. I was simply trying to engage the majority leader in a simple question, and I'll lay out the question here, and I think it deserves an answer, not to me, but to the American people. Last week, I had written the majority leader noting that several press reports have stated that he has exempted much of his staff, specifically his leadership staff, from Obamacare, from the mandate of the Obamacare statute that we and our staffs go to the exchanges for our health care, and he has exempted much of his staff from that. So I laid out some specific and pertinent and important questions related to that in a letter to him dated December 10th last week. Got no response. I obviously got no response this morning. In fact, he wouldn't even yield for any question. I think that's unfortunate. It's unfortunate not because I personally deserve an answer. It's unfortunate because this is important. And I think his constituents and the American people deserve an answer. So I restate those 4 specific questions in my letter, and they are in my letter, and I ask unanimous consent to make the letter part of the record. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, the minority whip.
Mr. President, I know we are going to be voting on the budget that was negotiated by Senator Murray and Paul Ryan, and 67 senators have voted for cloture on that, so we will have a vote on passage this afternoon, I think about 4:30. But I wanted to raise an issue that has been raised previously yesterday, and that is with the process by which the Senate is operating, where no amendments are being allowed either on the budget or on the defense authorization bill, which is the next bill that we will turn to by the decision of the majority leader. I have congratulated Senator Murray and I congratulate Congressman Ryan for their negotiation, but I do think there is an error that has been identified that needs to be corrected in the bill, and which could easily be corrected if the majority leader would reconsider his decision not to allow any amendments. And this specifically has to do with the discriminatory way in which active duty military pensions are being penalized in a unique way, and not even federal workers who are going to be treated differently prospectively. Not even civilian federal workers are being treated in the same way that our active duty military are. Several of my colleagues came to the floor here yesterday, the senator from New Hampshire, the senator from South Carolina, others, and pointed out this discriminatory treatment, which could easily be fixed. I don't have any doubt but that the Senate would, as we attempted to do yesterday, the senator from Alabama offered an attempt to take down the amendment tree that the majority leader has filled, and that, for people who don't follow the minutia and the detail of what happens here in the Senate, the majority leader has basically blocked any opportunity to offer an amendment that would fix this discriminatory treatment for our military service members. And I think I've heard at least 2 of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle say that, well, we can come back and do this next year. Well, why do it next year if we could do it now And I believe that if the Senate was given an opportunity to make this correction, I don't blame the senator from Washington and Congressman Ryan in their efforts to come up with a budget to do what they did, but I do blame us if we don't fix it now, this week, when it's within our power to do so, and it's within the power of the majority leader to allow us to vote on that and to make that happen. And I don't have any doubt whatsoever that if we were able to come up with an appropriate pay-for and a substitute for this cut in military pensions, that it would pass like a hot knife through butter in the House of Representatives when they reconvene. So I think, unfortunately, this is a product of the way that the majority leader has decided to run the Senate. And I have another example of that, which I want to turn to now. This has to do with an amendment that I've offered on the defense authorization bill, which is the next bill that we will turn to after the passage of the budget. Now, the defense authorization bill is a very important piece of legislation, and I congratulate the Senator Inhofe and the House, both on the majority party and minority party, from coming up with, I think, a pretty good bill. But the problem is, once again, the majority leader has decided to transform the Senate into basically a railroad and to jam this bill through this week, probably by tomorrow night, without any opportunity to offer any amendments. And I think that's a terrible mistake. The last time in recent memory that the majority party decided to jam through a piece of legislation, that was Obamacare. I remember voting on Christmas Eve, something I hope we don't repeat again this year, voting on that bill on Christmas Eve, and that was a party line vote in the House and the Senate. And now we're discovering, as Obamacare is being implemented, that a lot of the promises that were made to the American people, like if you like what you have, you can keep it, the cost of your health care will go down an average of $2,500 for a family of four, that all of those were false. Well, that's what happens, the kind of mistakes that are made when there's not bipartisan efforts to come up with the compromise legislation. And instead, the majority party uses the power it has to jam things through. We make mistakes. Things aren't adequately considered. And I don't care who you are, we all can benefit from other people's ideas and suggestions, and that is the genius of the checks and balances in the United States Senate and under our form of government. But the majority leader has decided to put all that aside. I read today in Politico, he said he doesn't care that people are complaining about his my way or the highway approach. But it's not just about our rights as senators to participate in the process. It's not only about the rights of the 26 million people that I represent in Texas who are essentially being shut out of the process. This is about making mistakes that hurt people, mistakes that we would not make if we had took the time in a bipartisan way to try to address some of these concerns. And this discriminatory treatment of the military pensions is one example. But here's another one. When members of al-Qaeda struck our nation on September the 11th, 2001, they made it clear that they viewed the entire American homeland as the battlefield. We were reminded of this again about 4 years ago when a radical jihadist who happened to be wearing a uniform of the United States Army, Major Nadal Hassan, opened fire at Fort Hood Army Base in Killeen, Texas. That shooter killed 12 American soldiers and 1 civilian and shot and injured 30 more. Now, this is a terrible tragedy. And I remember President Obama coming down for the memorial service where we honored the lives of these people who lost their life in this terrible attack. But no matter how you slice it, this was a terrorist attack on American soil. not much different, except in the means by which it was carried out, than what happened on September the 11th, 2001. Prior to committing this terrible terrorist attack, the Fort Hood shooter exchanged no fewer than 20 emails with a senior al-Qaeda operative, Anwar al-Awlaki, who was subsequently killed by a U.S. drone attack in Yemen by order of the President of the United States. Now, the shooter, Major Hassan, had essentially become more and more radicalized over time, and this is a real problem with our military that seem to have turned a blind eye. But it's also a problem with when the federal government calls this workplace violence and doesn't call it a terrorist attack, which it actually was. He opened fire in the name of global jihad in hopes of defending the Islamic Empire and supporting his Muslim brothers. That's why he asked the late Mr. Awlaki if Islamic law justified, quote, killing U.S. soldiers and officers, close quote. And that's why he yelled out, Allah Akbar, before committing this massacre. If a U.S. soldier is killed in Afghanistan by an al-Qaeda-inspired terrorist alongside the Taliban, he or she will posthumously be given a Purple Heart award, and his or her family will receive the requisite benefits that go along with losing your life in the service to your country. And yet, the United States government has chosen to discriminate against these people who lost their lives at Fort Hood 4 years ago at the hands of a terrorist who tragically happened to be a member of the uniformed military of the United States, Major Nadal Hassan, who has subsequently been convicted of these crimes. Well, even though Major Hassan saw himself as an Islamic warrior serving the cause of an officially designated terrorist organization, the United States government has chosen to treat this as something that it is not, which is an ordinary crime, or in the Orwellian use of the phrase workplace violence, it is an exercise in political correctness run amok. But the government's argument is that because the Fort Hood shooter was not acting under the direct and explicit direction of a foreign terrorist group, these victims of this terrorist attack 4 years ago are not eligible for Purple Hearts or the benefits that they deserve. Now, al-Qaeda, as we know, doesn't issue business cards or staff IDs, so sometimes it's a little bit difficult to say which terrorists are, quote, officially part of al-Qaeda and which ones are not. But the distinction is irrelevant. The war on terrorism, as we know, has evolved considerably since September the 11th, 2001. And al-Qaeda has evolved too. Whether it's in Iraq or Afghanistan or now Yemen and other places, al-Qaeda has morphed. Several months ago, the group's top leader, al-Zawahiri, urged his followers to conduct exactly the kind of terrorist attack that occurred at Fort Hood and occurred at Boston in 2013. Zawahiri said, quote, "These dispersed attacks can be carried out by one brother or a small number of brothers," close quote. Now let's imagine that a radical Islamist heard these words, contacted an al-Qaeda cleric to ask about killing Americans, and then went on to slaughter a number of U.S. soldiers. Well, it shouldn't matter where those killings took place, and it shouldn't matter whether the killer had, quote, formal ties with al-Qaeda or not. There really isn't any doubt about Hassan's ties to al-Qaeda or as being inspired by someone who the President of the United States put on a kill list for a drone because he knew they were recruiting and inspiring attacks against the American people. So if it's good enough for the President of the United States to order a drone attack on an American citizen in Yemen, it ought to be good enough for this body to recognize this was a terrorist attack because of Hassan's inspiration and communication with this very same terrorist, and we ought to award these families the Purple Hearts that these service members are entitled to and the benefits that they deserve. Well, it's clear that these casualties at Fort Hood were part of America's struggle against al-Qaeda in the global war on terrorism. They were casualties of war that continues to rage in Afghanistan and that just recently claimed an additional 4 American lives, but also extended to places like Benghazi, Libya, where 4 Americans were killed. Whether or not the Fort Hood shooter had al-Qaeda stamped on his forehead or not is irrelevant. He was unquestionably a disciple of al-Qaeda's poisonous ideology, which has fueled death and destruction around the globe and here in our homeland. Well, as I indicated at the beginning, I've sponsored legislation that would make the Fort Hood victims eligible for the honors and benefits available to their fellow U.S. troops serving in an overseas combat zone. I've offered a modified version of that bill as an amendment to the Defense Authorization Bill, which we will take up immediately following passage of the budget legislation this afternoon. But the Majority Leader has refused to allow a vote on it. You may recall before the Thanksgiving recess, we had, I believe it was 2 amendments to the Defense Authorization Bill, and then the question was what other amendments might be offered. The Majority Leader made clear he wasn't going to allow any other amendments except of his own choosing, thus denying the minority any opportunity to help amend and improve the Defense Authorization Bill, one of the most important pieces of legislation this body takes up every year. And so cloture was not invoked, and now in the waning days right before the Christmas holidays, the Majority Leader seeks to jam through this bill that was agreed upon by basically 4 people behind closed doors, and to not deny me, representing 26 million Texans, and deny those of us who care about calling a spade when it comes to terrorism, an opportunity to offer an amendment on the Defense Authorization Bill. And it's a mistake. No less a mistake than denying an opportunity to fix the mistake of discriminatory treatment of our service members whose pensions are being cut as a result of the budget negotiation. Not only has the Majority Leader refused to allow a vote on this Purple Hearts Amendment, he's refused to allow any other amendments, both on this budget negotiation or on the Defense Authorization. As I said, the budget agreement passed by the House of Representatives would slash military retirement benefits by about $6 billion over the next decade. I've heard on cable TV at least 2 members of this body of the other party who said we need to fix that. The senator from New Hampshire has offered legislation, I believe, and I've heard the senator from Virginia, Senator Kaine, say we can come in and fix this with a scalpel after the fact. Well, we don't need to wait for that. We could do that today. I'm confident that we could reach an agreement in this body today to remove that discriminatory treatment for our active duty military contained in this underlying bill if the Majority Leader would just listen to his own members, listen to the American people, listen to those who care about our service members and want to make sure that they are not treated in such an unfair and discriminatory fashion. But instead, the Majority Leader has decided it's my way or the highway. We know these cuts will even affect combat wounded veterans who've been medically retired. Now, my state is proud home to more veterans than any other state other than California, and many of my constituents are outraged that the Majority Leader won't even allow us to vote on this issue. And I would tell my friends across the aisle, it's going to come up again. It came up yesterday, it'll come up again. We will be reoffering these amendments to fix this discriminatory treatment as long as we're in session. And I hope members of both parties can put politics aside for 1 minute, come together and address the needs of our military families and those who have worked so hard and sacrificed so much to preserve our freedom. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Senator from Maine.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that I be able to address the Senate for 15 minutes.
Without objection.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that an intern in my office, Deanna Wilbur, be given floor privileges for the purposes of being here during these remarks.
Without objection.
Madam President, we're going to have a historic vote this afternoon, historic at least in recent history, because for the first time in 3-4 years, we're going to pass a budget. At least I certainly hope so. It's historic because it was a budget that was arrived at, the process was not perfect, but it was arrived at fundamentally through negotiations, through discussions, through compromise between the chairman of the Senate Budget Committee and the chair of the House Budget Committee, and we finally are talking to each other. I think this agreement is important. I think this vote is important for really 3 basic reasons. One is that the agreement maintains the momentum of deficit reduction that has been in place here since the summer of 2011 when the Budget Control Act was passed. In fact, rather than breaking the budget numbers, it actually improves in terms of deficit reduction by some $22 billion. And it maintains, as I said, the momentum. One of the points that's been lost in the discussion about the budget and the budget deficit is that the federal budget deficit has fallen faster in the last 2.5, 3 years than at any time in the past 40 or 50 years. It has fallen from almost 10% of GDP to under 4% of GDP over the past 2.5 years. That's progress. I think one of the problems we have around here often is that we don't know how to declare victory. We don't celebrate our successes. I'm not prepared to declare victory in the fight for fiscal responsibility, but I am prepared to declare progress. And I think that's what we've made when we had more than trillion-dollar deficits that have been cut more than in half. So the first reason I think this bill should be supported is that it is not a budget buster by any means. It is instead a continuation of the momentum toward rational fiscal policies that we have been on, and I think it's something that we should continue. Number 2, this bill, this budget bill, will finally get us out of the business of governing by crisis, of lurching from crisis and threats of shutdown and continuing resolutions, year to year, month to month, quarter to quarter. It will provide some certainty to the Congress, to the government, and to the country about what the budget numbers are going to be. I think it's important that people realize exactly what it is we're voting on today. Essentially, it's one number. It's what's called a top-line number. This is not the budget that embodies all the detailed decisions about where those dollars go. Those decisions will be made by the 2 appropriations committees of the 2 houses between now and the middle of January. But by providing a number, those committees now know what their targets are. They know what their limits are. They know what they have to work with, and it will enable them to make the kind of decisions of priorities and spending that we should have been making all along. But by governing by continuing resolution, essentially what we're doing is using last year's priorities and the year before and the year before that. And then, of course, the sequester on top of a continuing resolution is really a double budgetary whammy, because the sequester is a cut. That's difficult enough to deal with, but it's a cut that was designed to be stupid, and it succeeded. It was designed to be so unacceptable that the Congress would feel that they had to find an alternative. Unfortunately, this past March, that didn't happen. So the sequester went into place, which was across-the-board cuts by account. So within the military, within the Pentagon, within the Navy, within the FAA, within the Department of Transportation, each account had to be cut. Some accounts probably could use some cutting, and other accounts desperately needed the funding that was made available. So this bill relieves that irrationality of the sequester while maintaining the sequester's downward pressure on spending. And finally, and I think most importantly, what this bill that we'll be voting on this afternoon will do is demonstrate to the country that we can do our job. I was talking to people in Maine yesterday, and they said, well, why should you be puffing up your chest and pounding your chest about just doing what you ought to be doing all along? And I couldn't really argue with that, except that we haven't been doing it. We haven't been doing our job. And the fact that we're now at least inching toward doing it in the manner that we're supposed to is progress. At least it's progress in recent history. And I think that's one of the most important parts of this bill, and I think that's the signal that it sends to the country that we can, in fact, talk to each other. We can, in fact, compromise. We can, in fact, make arrangements, financial and fiscal arrangements around here that make sense, that are rational, that are prioritized, and we can do our jobs. When I was in Maine last weekend, the most common comment that I got was, why can't those people down there talk to each other? Why can't they work things out? We do that in our town meetings, we do that in our businesses, we do that in our families. Why can't they? Well, in this case, they have. It wasn't a perfect process, but at least it involved bipartisan, bicameral negotiation that gets us to the point where we have a budget that we can vote on today. Do I like it? I don't like every piece of it. I don't like the pension hit that the senator from Texas just described. That wouldn't have been in my proposal. In fact, I made a proposal at the budget conference that was quite different from this one. It wasn't accepted. That's how this place works. My favorite philosopher, Mick Jagger, said you can't always get what you want. But if you try sometimes, you just might find you get what you need. And what we need right now is a budget. It's something that we can work from that gives us some certainty. And I believe that we can fix this pension program. In fact, I've joined with Senator Shaheen of New Hampshire on a bill that would replace the cuts to the military pension with dealing with some offshore tax benefits that I think is a much more sensible way to fill that $6 billion gap. And we can do that because the pension proposal doesn't take effect for 2 years, till December of 2015. So we can fix that, but we've got to get this budget passed now. Why can't they talk? They have talked, and I think that's important. Now, I want to turn to a slightly different topic, but it is related to the budget. In 1997, the Congress passed something called the Sustainable Growth Rate, which was designed to control reimbursement rate for physicians and providers under Medicare. The problem is it's turned into a monster that reduces physician fees to the point where they won't serve Medicare patients unless it's fixed. And each year, since 2002, we have fixed it year by year, but it's always temporary. It's always a patch. In fact, it's gotten its own name in the lexicon of Washington, the doc fix. And it's something that we have to do. Everybody knows we have to do. But why not fix it for good? The Congressional Budget Office tells us if we fixed it once and for all, it would cost $116 billion over the next 10 years. Now, that sounds like a big number, but it happens that there's a place we can go to get that money that I think fits with it very well. In 1990, under President George H.W. Bush, The Medicaid drug program was created, and because the government was buying drugs under Medicaid in very large quantities, they sought a volume discount from the pharmaceutical companies. Perfectly rational. Any of us ask for a volume discount if we're buying in large quantities, and indeed Medicaid-eligible beneficiaries had discounts or rebates on their drugs from 1990 to 2006. In 2006, Part D of Medicare was passed, which provided a drug benefit to Medicare recipients, but one of the wackiest parts of that bill said that the government can no longer negotiate for volume discounts. Now, I hear a lot of discussion around here about private enterprise and business, and we should run the government like a business. No rational business would buy any product, cars, gasoline, drugs, or anything else in enormous quantities and not seek and gain from the sellers some kind of volume discount. Senator Rockefeller has introduced S-740, which essentially says let's return Medicaid beneficiaries, not all Medicare beneficiaries, but Medicaid recipients to the status of prior to 2006, where they will get applied to their drug purchases, or the government actually gets, the same kind of rebates that they got for the 16 years from 1990 to 2006. What will this produce? $140 billion over the next 10 years. It will not cut expenses to recipients. It will only save the government money. It just seems to me that this is a sensible way to fix the doc fix once and for all, and to do something that makes sense for the taxpayers, which is acquire for them volume discounts, volume rebates that are available today for other Medicaid recipients who aren't under Medicare and for the VA, and it just puts them on the same status, these so-called dual eligibles, people who are eligible for Medicaid and Medicare. Just this change would save $140 billion. It would enable us to fix the doc fix permanently, and it would also contribute about $30 billion to deficit reduction over the next 10 years. Madam President, I think we do have a historic opportunity this afternoon to pass a budget. The first budget, by the way, produced by a divided Congress, where the two houses were in different political hands, the first budget produced by a divided Congress since 1986. And I think that is an achievement. It's something that a month ago I wouldn't have bet too much on, but I'm really appreciative and admiring of Chairman Murray and Chairman Ryan for coming together, putting their ideological issues aside, coming up with an arrangement, an agreement that allows us to have some certainty and can signal to the country that we are, in fact, capable of doing the most fundamental responsibility we have, which is to pass a budget. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Assistant Majority Leader.
Madam President, I want to thank my colleague from Maine for his statement and support for this effort. This is an historic moment. It's been 4 or 5 years since we have enacted and passed a budget agreement between the House and Senate in a divided government. We have found many excuses and ways around it, but we are facing our responsibility today in the United States Senate, and we are hoping that yesterday's procedural vote with 67 Democrats and Republicans joining together is an indication of the successful find later today when this measure comes up for a final vote. Before I go any further, I want to salute my colleague, my friend, and my fellow leader in the United States Senate, Senator Patty Murray of Washington. Patty, a few years ago, was given a tough assignment. She was given the assignment to chair the so-called super committee. I'd been involved in a lot of deficit negotiations up to that point, and I thought, oh my goodness, she's walking into a minefield. Well, she did a professional job, a bipartisan effort. It didn't succeed, but she learned in the process not only more about our budget challenge, but also more about the leaders in the budget process. And I think it was that painful experience with the super committee that set the stage for the much more successful negotiation over this budget agreement with Paul Ryan. Now, Paul Ryan is no stranger to those of us in Illinois. His congressional district borders on our state in Wisconsin. I know Paul. I like him. I respect him. We disagree on a lot of substantive issues, but I respect him as a person of substance and as a person of values who tries to solve problems. He showed with Senator Patty Murray that Democrats and Republicans can sit down in a room together, respect one another's differences, and still come to an agreement. What a refreshing development in this town where so many times we just fall flat on our face trying to come up with a solution. I also want to commend Paul Ryan, while I'm on the subject, for his leadership on the immigration issue. It's not easy for him to step up as a conservative Republican and support comprehensive immigration reform, but he's done it. He came to Chicago and made that announcement with Luis Gutierrez, a congressman from the city of Chicago who's a national leader on immigration. I only say that because if we have more of that kind of dialogue, more of that kind of agreement, we will have a better Congress and the American people will know it. Right now, we are languishing in approval ratings across the country, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that we just spend too much time fighting and not enough time trying to find solutions. This budget agreement is a solution. Is it perfect? Of course not. There are parts of this budget agreement I don't like at all. But I've come to learn that if you're going to get anything done in Washington for the good of the people of this country, you have to be prepared to accept in an agreement some things you might not agree with. We found that with comprehensive immigration reform. We'll find it today with this budget agreement. This plan isn't perfect, but it's going to enable us to avoid a shutdown of the government. Did we learn a lesson or not just a few months ago? We shut down the government of the United States of America for 16 days. One senator came to the floor on the other side of the aisle speaking 21 hours in an effort to inspire others to join him in the shutdown. And sadly, it worked for 16 days. 800,000 federal employees or more were sent home with the promise that eventually they'd be paid. And millions of Americans were denied the basic services of our government during that government shutdown. Well, we managed to emerge from that with the promise that we would fund our government with a continuing resolution until the middle of January. But then the burden fell on Patty Murray and Paul Ryan and the members of that conference committee to come up with a solution. And they did. And that's what's before us today. Those who are voting no on that don't have an alternative. They really don't have a plan. They're just angry or upset or basically opposed, but they don't have an alternative. And if it means that they would want another government shutdown, well, so be it. But thank goodness an overwhelming bipartisan majority in the House of Representatives voted for this plan. And yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, we had 12 Republicans join us, and all of the Democrats, 55 Democrats, 67 voted in favor of this bipartisan budget plan. What is especially important to me as a member of the Appropriations Committee is it not only is avoiding another government shutdown, it's a 2-year plan. And I said to Senator Murray when she called me with the details, that is one of the strongest arguments in favor of this I can imagine. To think now that the Appropriations Committee can sit down and do its work for the rest of this year with a budget target number, I have a pretty substantial responsibility on the Appropriation Committee. I chair the Subcommittee on Defense and Intelligence. In that subcommittee, our bill alone is about $600 billion, just a little south of that, and it embodies almost 60% of all the discretionary spending of the United States federal government. We're going to get a chance now, and I've already sat down with Congressman Frelinghuysen of New Jersey, who chairs the same subcommittee in the House, to work out a bipartisan appropriation bill for the defense of America. Is there anything more important than our national security? We have to start there. And we're going to be able to do it now in a thoughtful way because of this budget number. Those who are voting no would cast us again into the darkness. A continuing resolution. For those who are on the outside looking in, a continuing resolution is like saying to a family, listen, next year we're going to give you the checkbook ledger from last year, keep writing the same checks for the same amount, and we're sure everything will work out. Well, it doesn't. Instead, because of this budget agreement, we can start looking at ways to save money that will not harm our men and women in uniform and will keep America strong and create a national defense. We're going to also work in this bill to start to repair America's fraying social safety net. In other words, protecting the most vulnerable in America. Because this agreement stands for the premise that we are going to treat defense and non-defense spending and cuts equally. That was an agreement we started. It's one that they've honored with this. We've made real progress in the last 4 years to cut our federal deficit in half. The President inherited an economic mess. He has put this ship of state sailing forward with deficit reduction. We're going to cut the deficit even further under this bipartisan budget plan, but in a much more thoughtful way. I'm going to be voting yes for the budget, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. I see that the Republican leader is on the floor, and I know he has a very busy schedule, so I'm not going to give the rest of my speech as promised. But I do want to say leave with one closing thought. There is another deficit in America beyond our budget deficit that is even more dangerous to America's future, and that's the rapidly deteriorating situation that many working families are facing. We have an opportunity deficit in America. President Obama called this opportunity deficit the defining challenge of our time, and he is right. We are starting to lose our balance between personal wealth and our commonwealth. I don't begrudge anyone wealth and success in America. We celebrate it. But we also believe in fairness. We believe in the dignity of work. We believe that if you work hard and follow the rules, you ought to be able to provide for your family with the basics of life and with the dream of an even better life for the next generation. After we pass this budget, after we get our appropriation bills underway, we are going to come forward and I hope in a bipartisan manner address some of the pillars of income equality in America. An increase in the minimum wage, overwhelmingly supported by both political parties and independent voters across the United States. An opportunity to make sure through the Affordable Care Act that every family has an opportunity for health insurance in America. A press conference which I'll have later today with Senators Warren and Reid on the whole student loan debt crisis facing so many families. We have reached a point now where the student loan debt in America is greater than the credit card debt. It has devastating impacts on working families across America. These and so many others should be part of an agenda to repair the opportunity deficit, and I hope that the Republicans will join us in a bipartisan effort, and I ask consent that the remainder of my remarks be placed in the record.
Without objection.
I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Republican leader.
I'm going to proceed on my leader time.
The leader has that right. Please proceed.
I rise today to give voice to the people of eastern Kentucky who are hurting due to this administration's war on coal. Recently, I traveled to Pikeville. Pikeville is in the central Appalachian coal fields to hear firsthand from coal miners, their families, those in the energy industry, and others about how their communities are being ravaged, literally ravaged, by EPA's excessive, overly burdensome regulations on coal. Now, the EPA didn't want to listen to these folks. I tried to get the EPA to have a hearing in eastern Kentucky, and they refused. So I did it. I held this listening session to put a human face on the suffering that is being felt in Appalachia due in large part to this administration's war on coal. And so I want to share with my colleagues just a little bit of what I heard in that listening session down in Pikeville a few days ago. This is a picture of Howard Abshire right here. Howard Abshire. He's a former production foreman and a fourth-generation coal miner. Howard Abshire. In the audience during his testimony was his son, right behind him right here, Griffin. He's a fifth-generation coal miner. What the father and son have in common is they're both out of work. Both the father and the son are two of over 5,000 Kentuckians
who've lost their jobs in the war on coal. Two of the casualties of the President's war on coal, Howard and Griffin, out of work. Now, Howard is holding up a piece of coal right here in his left hand. Coal mining is what the EPA wants to stamp out. But coal is also the powerful substance that powers our homes, provides light and heat, and fuels the commerce of goods and services worldwide. This is coal, he said. This is coal, he said. This keeps the lights on. Howard is only one of many coal miners laid off for lack of coal mining work. This is what he said. Look in our schools, look in our nursing homes, look in our pharmacies. Howard said, we're hurting. We're hurting. We need help, he said, but we don't want to be bailed out. Howard said, we don't want to be bailed out. We want to work. Howard doesn't want to be bailed out. He wants to work. Now, seated next to Howard is Jimmy Rose, right here. This is Jimmy Rose. He's a veteran. He fought in Iraq. He's a former coal miner. Jimmy was perhaps the most famous attendee at the listening session because he brought attention to the war on coal to a national television audience on America's Got Talent. Jimmy's a songwriter and a singer. His song, Coal Keeps the Lights On. Coal Keeps the Lights On. That was his song that he used in his competition in America's Got Talent. And it spoke directly to the hardship in his community caused largely by the war on coal. This is Jimmy Rose right here, and here's what he had to say. It's in our heritage, he said. It's in our blood. Addressing the Obama administration, Jimmy said, look at what you're doing, who you're affecting. Coal mining, Jimmy said, is a way of life, just like I say in the song. Don't kill our way of life. I hope one day I can always say coal kept the lights on. I also heard from Monty Boyd, the owner of Wayne Supply Company and Walker Machinery, a mining and construction equipment distributor that serves Kentucky, Indiana, West Virginia, and Ohio. The company employs 1,900 people and operates 25 stores. Wayne Supply this year celebrated 100 years of operations, yet, this is what Monty had to say. At a time when I should be excited about our future, I am full of concern and uncertainty because our future outlook is bleak, due to the regulatory ambush of the coal industry by the EPA. He went on to say, coal in Kentucky is more than just mining. It is the driving force that keeps our energy rates affordable, keeps our manufacturing sector competitive, and is the economic lifeblood of eastern Kentucky. Monty went on. He said, I'm disheartened to continually see the federal government and the EPA take such an anti-business stance that destroys an industry that is vital to our regional economy. Monty said the federal government appears to be choosing the winners and losers in regard to the energy sector of America. Now, those are strong words from someone with a good perspective on Kentucky's coal industry. I also heard from Anita Miller over here in the photograph. Anita Miller. She's a manager of safety for Apollo Fuels in Middlesboro in my state. She's worked in the industry for more than 15 years. And here's what Anita had to say. My son walked earlier than my daughter.
every time she would try to stand up, he would either knock her down or put his hand on her head so she couldn't stand. She said, "This is what's happening to our coal industry." Anita went on to say, every time we try to stand up for ourselves, someone either knocks or holds us down. You can't really buy anything or make plans for the future because you don't know what the future holds. My wish is that the people who are trying so hard to destroy the coal industry would just stop for a minute and think about the hot showers they take, the lights they turn on, and that first hot cup of coffee in the morning, and remember that it came from electricity powered by coal. I couldn't agree more with what Anita says. It is apparently too easy for EPA bureaucrats and the Obama administration to make decisions that have a huge impact on the people of eastern Kentucky. They don't think about the consequences. And I might add, without bothering to meet face-to-face with the people they hurt. The EPA scheduled listening sessions for its new regulations only, Madam President, in cities far, far away from coal country, both geographically and philosophically. Cities including New York, Boston, Seattle, and San Francisco. They held 11 listening sessions in all, but the closest one to eastern Kentucky was in Atlanta, requiring Kentuckians to make a 14-hour round-trip drive simply to attend. So it's pretty clear from the location of all these listening sessions, the EPA did not want any real input. That's why I convened a listening session in Pikeville that resulted in the powerful testimony I've shared with my colleagues today. Since the Obama EPA would not come to Kentucky, I brought the voices of Kentuckians to EPA. We held 3 panels composed of those in the coal industry, miners and their families, and local elected officials to illuminate the disruption in these communities caused in large part by the war on coal. Many of my constituents filled out comment cards, and my office delivered them yesterday to the EPA along with the hearing testimony. I want to leave my colleagues with the comments of one Kentuckian, Justin Bradford, who's a retired teacher in Pikeville. Here's what Justine Bradford, here's what she wrote. Dear EPA, will you please tell Santa Claus all we want for Christmas this year is to be able to work? This is Justine Bradford. Tell EPA to tell Santa all we want for Christmas this year is to be able to work. Here in eastern Kentucky, we too are real people. Please help us find a job. Come and work in our shoes. So, Madam President, the people of eastern Kentucky believe in coal, and with good reason. The abundance of coal in America, and in Kentucky in particular, is a God-given resource. For decades, it has powered our factories, transported our goods, and warmed our homes. Yes, the blessings of coal come with the responsibility to use it in an environmentally friendly way. But they also come with the responsibility to see that hardworking Kentuckians who rely on coal for an honest day's work and steady pay are given every chance to earn that. And they come with the right of all Americans to take full advantage of this God-given domestic resource to produce clean, cheap, and safe energy. These things have been true for many decades. There's no reason they shouldn't still hold true now. Eastern Kentucky must look for some economic opportunities beyond coal, and I support that. And I know the people of the region can accomplish great things. It's vital that we consider eastern Kentucky's future. But let me make this point. It is equally vital that we not give up on eastern Kentucky's present. As we consider eastern Kentucky's future, it is important that we not give up on eastern Kentucky's present. And coal is the key to the present in eastern Kentucky. So the Obama EPA has the testimony I heard in Pikeville. Whether they wanted it or not, they've got it. Eastern Kentucky is going to continue to push back in this war on coal. The war isn't over yet, not by a long shot. This president will be gone in 3 years, and the coal will still be in the ground. The people of the region are resilient, and they will keep fighting. So I'm very hopeful for a positive outcome in Eastern Kentucky and the Appalachian region, and I'm going to defend them in every way that I can. Now, Madam President, on another issue, the National Defense Authorization Act is one of the essential pieces of legislation the Senate considers every year. This is legislation, obviously, that authorizes funding for our troops and the equipment and the support they need to carry out their mission. This is legislation that, along with the funding that follows in the appropriations bills, puts muscle behind America's most important strategic objectives across the globe. And yet, under the Democratic majority, this bill has basically languished since last summer. About 6 months. 6 months have lapsed since the Armed Services Committee first reported the bill out of committee. Now, with just days to go before Christmas, after wasting valuable time ramming through political appointee after political appointee, the majority wants to rush this crucial legislation through without the debate that it deserves. They want to push it through the Senate without even giving the minority the ability to offer more than a single amendment, just one. Just to give you some perspective, 381 amendments were proposed to this bill last year. We agreed on 142 of them. The year before that, hundreds were again proposed and many were agreed to. That's the way the Senate used to operate. And keep in mind that all of this follows right on the heels of the Democratic nuclear power grab just a few weeks back. So this is what's become of the Senate under the current Democratic majority. Rules and traditions of the Senate that have served us well for years are broken or ignored in the interest of the short-term power grab. And some of the most important legislation that we consider as a body is rushed through at the last minute without any real opportunity for debate or amendment. As some have suggested, the Senate has become a lot like the House under the current Democratic leadership. From the standpoint of the minority, it's actually a lot worse. Committee chairmen have been cut out of the process. Senators who thought they'd have an opportunity to legislate have been told they're basically irrelevant, and evidently so are the rules. Senate rules are now just optional to Washington Democrats. As the Obamacare mandates they decide they don't like, the Senate rules are just as optional as the Obamacare mandates they decide they don't like. All of which obviously makes a mockery of our institutions and our laws. And all of which suggests that this is a majority that has zero confidence in its own ideas. This is a majority that can't allow the minority to have a meaningful say when it comes to nominees. This is a majority that won't allow members to offer amendments when it counts. Why? Well, because of a fear that the minority might actually win the argument and carry the day. And that's exactly what we're seeing with the NDAA. Now, the majority leader won't allow a robust amendment process because he can't stomach a vote on Iran sanctions. He knows the administration would lose that vote decisively. And he knows that many members of his own caucus would vote alongside Republicans to strengthen those sanctions. So rather than allow a Democratic vote that might embarrass the administration, the majority leader simply won't permit that vote to happen. Here's another consequence. By denying the Senate the ability to legislate, debate, and amend the National Defense Authorization Act, the Defense Appropriations Act, and additional Iran sanctions, and by refusing the Senate the ability to vote on authorization for the use of force against Syria, the Majority Leader has abdicated this chamber's constitutional role in shaping and overseeing national security policy. Without considering these matters, the Senate has been unable to address the programs, policies, and weapon systems necessary to make the President's strategic pivot to the Asia-Pacific theater real. Are the programs in place adequate to address China's aggressive encroachment upon the territorial and navigational rights of other nations in the region? Through defense legislation, we have considered the necessary trade-offs to fund adequate force structure. Have we done that? Can we execute this pivot and maintain adequate force structure in the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean? We won't have any of that debate, Madam President. No debate at all. We've been denied the opportunity to consider additional Iran sanctions, despite the assertions of the administration that it has worked with Congress to craft the current sanctions regime. Each time sanctions have been enacted during the Obama administration, these bills have basically been forced upon the President. He didn't want any of them. Despite the fact that the administration concedes that sanctions have brought the Iranians to the negotiating table, it is actively working to forestall additional sanctions tied to the verification of the interim agreement. The Senate should not be denied a vote concerning Iran. The President retains the power to veto anything we pass. What are our policies for preventing the ungoverned portions of Syria from becoming a terrorist safe haven? Unfortunately, we will not be having that debate this session of Congress. What is our policy for capturing, interrogating, and detaining terrorists? And if we had a coherent policy, would it survive after we draw down our forces in Afghanistan? We'll not have a chance to have that debate either. This is not simply a matter of denying the minority a voice in shaping foreign policy. It's an erosion of the Senate's responsibility. We've given President Obama a free rein in shaping these matters, and our allies in Asia and the Arab world are now questioning our commitment to remaining forward deployed and combat ready. More importantly, the courageous men and women who defend us every day shouldn't have to suffer from these tactics. Still, despite the egregious abuses we're seeing here of the legislative process, the underlying bill is an important bill. It contains the authorization needed for key military construction projects on our military bases, for multi-year procurement that's more efficient, that actually saves taxpayers money, and for the combat pay and special pay our troops deserve. It also, fortunately, extends the prohibition on bringing Guantanamo Bay prisoners into the United States, a provision that I and many other Americans strongly support. And it also authorizes funding for the next generation of aircraft carriers, something that's central to the success of the President's pivot to the Asian theater I mentioned earlier. In short, there are a lot of good things in the bill, even if the process that got us here is completely unacceptable. But let me be clear. The bill before us would be markedly improved if senators were allowed to offer amendments and more than just a day or two to debate it. The Democrats who run the Senate really need to think hard about what they're doing. This is just about the only regular order legislation we ever consider anymore. It's one of the only chances senators can count on to offer important amendments. And now the Senate Democratic majority is even trying to shut that down, too. We don't even do defense authorization anymore open to amendments. So in closing, I'd remind my colleagues on the other side that one day they'll find themselves in the minority again. You never know how soon that might occur. And they should think long and hard about what they're doing to this institution, because the Senate is bigger than any one party or presidential administration. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise today with my colleagues, Senator Blunt,